4th of July, the day we celebrate our freedom as a nation, communities throughout the country will gather together as fireworks erupt into the night sky. However, this is also true in a figurative sense as well. When we view freedom as the ability to do what we want, the power to choose for ourselves, which I would contend is the most accepted understanding of the term, it will also naturally lead to some fireworks. When people protest abortion, others will contend that no one has the right to tell them what they can do with their bodies. When people protest a white supremacist rally, others will argue that they have the right to freely assemble. When people advocate for gun control, others will assert that this right is protected by the U.S. Constitution. When Christians witness to their faith, others will protest that they have the right of freedom from religion. Freedom in our nation is cherished, and rightly so. But I would suggest that this kind of freedom is not understood or applied in a biblical sense. Taking a closer look at Paul's words in the 5th chapter of Galatians, let us consider what this term means for us as Christians. To help us better appreciate what Paul was saying in today's lesson, a little context as to why he wrote this letter in the first place would be quite helpful. Paul was greatly distressed over the actions of the Christians in Galatia. After he shared with them the good news of Jesus Christ, they inexplicably reverted back to obeying the old laws and customs, thinking that these things were what made them right with God. After hammering home the point that they are justified by grace through faith in Jesus alone, in the 5th chapter, Paul explains what this has to do with living their daily lives. For freedom, he says, Christ has set you free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. In Jesus Christ, we are free. In Jesus Christ, we are no longer bound by the law, a law that we could not measure up to in the first place. Clearly, this is very good news. On the surface, Paul appears to be affirming the modern-day understanding of freedom, that we are free to do as we please, that we are free from the laws and restraints that inhibit our ability to choose. But as we go a bit further in today's lesson, we discover that this is not what Paul is saying, not by a long shot. As we proceed to the 13th verse, Paul returns to this theme of freedom. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence. Yes, Paul affirms we are free in Jesus Christ. However, this is not a blank check to sin. This is not a license to do whatever we like, whenever we want. Reiterating this point, it was Jesus who once said, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin." When we think that we can live our lives however we choose, when we think that we can live self-indulgent lives, when we think that we can constantly gratify the flesh, to use Paul's words, we are not ultimately experiencing freedom. Just the opposite. We are placing ourselves in bondage. As I look around the sanctuary this morning, as I think about how we began our worship with a time of confession, it occurs to me that everyone here commits sin. And according to Jesus, that means that we are all slaves to sin. If you doubt the veracity of that statement, let me ask you this. How many of you have committed the same sin more times than you can count? How many of you have turned to God to confess that same sin over and over again? I know that my answer to those questions is a resounding yes. But in acknowledging our bondage to sin, by openly confessing our sin, the power that sin has over us begins to diminish. And we are able to embrace a new kind of freedom. A freedom that God offers us. When Paul talks about the freedom that we have in Jesus, it is not a freedom from responsibility. It is a freedom for responsibility. It is not a freedom to live however we want. It is a freedom to live for the sake of others. In words that sound completely confusing in our world today, Paul tells us, do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love, become slaves to one another. Paul was reminding the Christians in Galatia, as well as all of us, that if we want to be truly free, the way to do so is by becoming slaves to each other out of love for one another. Talk about a confusing statement. Talk about a counterintuitive statement. After all, how can anyone who is a slave be free? How can anyone who is free be a slave? The key to understanding Paul's words here, I believe, is that this is not something we have forced upon us. This is something we choose to do out of love. We willingly become slaves to one another. As I think about what Paul is saying here, my thoughts naturally turn to Jesus, and specifically in the upper room with his disciples. As I'm sure you probably remember, Jesus washed his disciples' feet that night. Not because he was forced to, but because he chose to, out of love. And as a result of that selfless action, became a slave to his disciples, and he showed them what true freedom looks like. And as Paul reminds us in today's lesson, it is the power of the Holy Spirit working through us that guides us into this freedom. A freedom to love our neighbors as ourselves. A freedom to show patience and gentleness, even toward those with whom we disagree. A freedom to be generous with our time, talents, and treasures. A freedom to be self-controlled rather than succumbing to the temptations around us. As I mentioned at the beginning of my sermon, freedom and fireworks seem to go together these days. And no doubt, when we view freedom from a purely individualistic standpoint, from the perspective that no one has the right to tell us what to do, it will invariably lead to some fireworks. But when we begin to see freedom from a biblical vantage point, that it is more than just our right to decide, but rather that it is our opportunity to serve one another out of love. It will lead us to living transformed lives, freely loving our neighbors, freely living for the sake of others, freely living in the Spirit, living the kind of life that Jesus lived. And quite frankly, that is what true freedom is all about.